In the 90s and early 2000s, to say that Ukraine was corrupt would be an understatement. Rampant bribery, poor economy, and oligarchical rule were everywhere in the newly independent nation. This corruption was most visible in Leonid Kuchma, Ukraine's first president, who proved that Ukraine was still left behind in the legacy of the former USSR. The USSR had controlled Ukraine as well as about a dozen other countries for many years, bathing them in a government filled with corruption and strict censorship. On one occasion, a nuclear plant collapsed in northern Ukraine, and the Russian government covered it up in order to avoid problems with the press. This type of censorship and dysfunction were common in Soviet Ukraine. After the USSR collapsed, Ukraine struggled in recovering. Kuchma made a bid for a privatization of Ukraine after the Soviets in order to increase economic freedom, but ended up leaving behind massive scandals, from a highly ineffective and corrupt privatization voucher system to a government-sponsored murder of reporter Georgy Gongadze, and which made the way for oligarchs to take over Ukraine's economy. Bribery was common in Ukraine's government. In a survey taken in 2001, GfK, a German market research company, surveyed thousands of people across 11 different countries in Central and Eastern Europe. In the survey, they asked participants if they ever gave bribes, and almost half of Ukrainian participants said that they did. In the survey, they also asked participants in each country whether they thought their country was corrupt. Ukraine had the highest percentage of respondents among these countries, with over 80% saying they lived in a corrupt state. Eventually, these scandals and problems in the government would pile up and culminate in Leonid Kuchma's resignation in 2004. With him gone, two of his former prime ministers ran against each other in a bid for the presidency. However, the election wasn't exactly fair. For one, freedom of press was largely non-existent in Ukraine, with the majority of news stations being somewhat controlled by Kuchma and his son-in-law. In an interview, Professor Mark R. Andrushik from the Harriman Institute at Columbia University discussed how Ukrainian language news on TV was almost all in favor of Leonid Kuchma's preferred candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. Yanukovych ran on skepticism of Ukraine joining the EU and advised closer ties with Russia. But he was against another Viktor Yushchenko, a reformist who wanted Ukraine to lower corruption and join the EU. He ran on a campaign called the 10 Steps Towards the People, rallying behind the words, "Bandits, go to jail!" Aside from the lack of freedom of press, there were other instances of corruption, with bandits stuffing ballot boxes and beating up pollsters, limiting freedom of elections. After an evident poisoning of Yushchenko, causing massive facial scarring, Yushchenko claimed it was a poisoning attempt made by Yanukovych and his friends in Russia, while Yanukovych denied it, claiming it was just food poisoning from bad sushi. The widespread fraud was visible, and people wanted to do something about it. So when the results went in for Yanukovych, Yushchenko's supporters went for the streets, in what would come to be known as the Orange Revolution. The Orange Revolution was largely a ground effort, led by Viktor Yushchenko in order to address the voter fraud and corruption in the Ukrainian government. At its height, over 500,000 people engaged in the protests, marching on the Independence Square in Kyiv, also known as the Maidan, wearing orange scarves and shirts, hence the name. The revolution seemingly worked. A recount of the vote was taken, and Yushchenko won, instantly adding new constitutional amendments. However, as time went on, those amendments would be repealed, and it would be clear that not much had changed. In terms of restoring the rights of Ukrainian citizens and putting responsibility on officials to avoid corruption, the promises and reforms made in the 2004 Orange Revolution were not durable. This was due to widespread political rife, slow implementation and regression of reforms, and the Orange Coalition overpromising from the start. The first and most obvious result of the Orange Revolution was the appointment of Yushchenko as president. This, being a main goal of the Orange Revolution, may make it seem like the movement was an overall success, as people like Anders Åslund and Yushchenko himself postulate. However, the other goals of addressing corruption, wealth inequality, and Russian influence were not adequately addressed. With that said, initially, the Orange Revolution, at least upon first glance, was pretty successful. Yushchenko and his Orange Coalition made a series of amendments to the Ukrainian constitution, giving more responsibilities to members of parliament, as well as splitting power between the president and the prime minister. Yushchenko's first prime minister was Yulia Tymoshenko, a reformist who worked with Yushchenko during the Orange Revolution. A strong opposition force to Kuchma and Yanukovych, she became known for her populism, anti-corruption policies, and reformist stance. Unlike Yushchenko, who was much more wary of ties with Russia, Tymoshenko advocated for a slightly more moderate approach, still advocating for EU membership, but also ensuring that Russo-Ukrainian ties remained positive. Tymoshenko also wanted bigger and more effective reforms than Yushchenko, leading to lots of infighting and her first dismissal as prime minister, but not her last. Tymoshenko alleged that by dismissing her, Yushchenko had created a rift within the newly formed movement. By 2006, Yanukovych, the same man Yushchenko had fought so hard against, was prime minister of the government. Yanukovych's reign, however, was short-lived. Yanukovych was removed from the premiership and replaced by Tymoshenko, continuing chaos in Yushchenko's failing government. By this point, it was becoming clear that Yushchenko was not going to be able to fill his promises. Yushchenko had promised strong anti-corruption action, but found himself going to the art gallery of Viktor Pinchuk, Leonid Kuchma's son-in-law. Yushchenko promised membership in the EU and NATO, but Ukraine was far from either of these organizations. As Yushchenko failed to follow through with his responsibilities, he was becoming increasingly unpopular, while Tymoshenko gained support. In 2009, Tymoshenko made a deal with Russia for Ukraine to pay the same price for Russian gas as it did for gas in the EU and other countries. This deal was very unpopular in Yushchenko's party bloc and was seen as an overreach in her authority. However, Tymoshenko viewed the claims of illegality as ridiculous. By 2010, Yushchenko had lost much of his original popularity, and the time was up. The elections were that year, and Yushchenko was eliminated in the first round with just over 5% of the vote, placing not in first or second, but fifth. The race became one between Tymoshenko and Yanukovych, and with that, the Orange Revolution had truly ended. Researchers such as Anders Aslund have argued that this revolution was, however, necessary in order to give Ukraine greater freedom. Putin has claimed the Orange Revolution was initiated with American interference, although there's no evidence for that. And still, many people in Ukraine consider the Orange Revolution to be a failure. Yanukovych, the political rival of the initial revolution, was elected just 5 years later, beating Tymoshenko in the finals. Unsurprisingly, Yanukovych was very corrupt, getting rid of many of the responsibilities of oligarchs, allowing for corruption to prosper. He postponed joining the EU and brought Ukraine closer to Russia, denying citizens the right to travel easily to the EU. His government repealed the amendments to the constitution made by Yushchenko, giving Yanukovych more power and taking it away from the people. By 2014, there was another revolution, similar to the Orange Revolution, but this time it turned violent. Protests were more extreme because Ukraine's situation was the worst it had been in 10 years. By the end of the revolution, Yanukovych resigned, and Russia invaded the Ukrainian territory of Crimea, marking the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which rages on today with huge civilian casualties. While the Orange Revolution may not have been a success, its impact on current events is undeniable. It also serves as an example of what to avoid doing after a revolution and demonstrates how not to run a revolution. But to this day, the Ukrainian Orange Revolution should be seen as a glimpse at the hope in orange.